September 7, 1776. Before sunrise, Sergeant Ezra Lee is alone inside a wooden capsule barely large enough to hold one man. The air is hot, stale, and running out. Above him floats HMS Eagle, a 64-gun British warship and the flagship of Admiral Richard Howe. Lee can hear sailors talking on the deck. They have no idea an American soldier is directly beneath them, turning a hand crank in the darkness. Attached to Lee's strange vessel is a keg of gunpowder with a timed ignition system. His orders are simple to describe and almost impossible to carry out. Drill into the bottom of Eagle, fasten the explosive beneath the hull, escape underwater, and sink the most important British ship in New York Harbor. No submarine had ever attacked a warship this way. No one knew whether the machine, the bomb, or the pilot would survive. And within minutes, one small mechanical failure would force Lee to make a decision that could either save his life or blow him apart beside the men chasing him. To understand why the Americans attempted something this desperate, look at New York in the late summer of 1776. Only weeks earlier, the colonies had declared independence. Now Britain had arrived to answer that declaration with overwhelming force. New York was more than a city. Its deep harbor could support the Royal Navy, while the Hudson River offered a route toward the interior. John Adams called the region a key to the continent. Both sides understood that whoever controlled it would control movement, supplies, and the political center of the war. George Washington moved his army to New York, but the forces gathering against him were unlike anything the rebellion had faced. British warships filled the harbor. Thousands of British and German troops assembled under General William Howe. On August 27, they smashed through the American defenses on Long Island. Washington and roughly 9,000 men ended the day trapped at Brooklyn Heights with the East River behind them. A nighttime evacuation, protected by darkness and fog, saved the army from capture, but it did not change the basic reality. Britain held the initiative, and its fleet could move soldiers and cannon almost wherever the water allowed. The Americans could not defeat that fleet in a conventional battle. They barely possessed a navy capable of challenging individual British vessels, much less the mass of warships around New York. So Washington listened to ideas that would have sounded absurd in a more comfortable moment. Fire ships, floating mines, secret machines, anything that might frighten the Royal Navy away from the city or force British commanders to pull their ships farther from shore. One of those ideas came from a quiet Connecticut farmer's son named David Bushnell. Bushnell had entered Yale later in life than most students and became fascinated by a question that many educated men believed had an obvious answer. Could gunpowder explode underwater? The common assumption was that water would smother the blast. Bushnell tested the idea and proved that a sealed charge could detonate beneath the surface. That discovery created a second question. If an explosive could work underwater, how could someone place it beneath an enemy ship without being seen? Bushnell's answer was a one-man submersible built from wood, iron, brass, valves, pumps, cranks, and ideas that seemed to belong to another century. Later generations called it Turtle because descriptions made it sound like two tortoise shells joined together. Ezra Lee remembered it differently. To him, it looked more like a large, round clam standing on its edge. No original plans survive, so every modern drawing is partly an interpretation. But the surviving descriptions reveal something extraordinary. Bushnell was trying to solve nearly every basic problem of submarine warfare at once. The operator sat upright in a chamber roughly 7 feet tall and about 6 feet across. He opened valves to let water into a ballast tank and make the craft sink. He used pumps to force the water out and rise again. One hand worked the mechanism that drove the vessel forward. Another control changed its depth. His feet operated pumps. A rudder helped him turn. A compass guided him when the shore disappeared. A depth gauge used a glowing material, described in surviving accounts as phosphorus or foxfire, so the operator could read it in darkness without lighting a candle and consuming precious air. Nothing inside the craft was automatic. The pilot was the engine, navigator, ballast crew, weapons officer, and escape system. When the Turtle was fully submerged, its ventilation could no longer refresh the air. Bushnell estimated that the man inside might have about 30 minutes before he needed to surface. That meant the operator had to move a heavy wooden vessel against tides and currents, find a ship in darkness, control his depth, attach a bomb, and get away, all while breathing from a shrinking pocket of air. The weapon was almost as ingenious as the boat. Turtle carried a detachable container packed with gunpowder. From inside the vessel, the pilot would press a hand-driven screw against the wooden hull of an enemy ship. Once the screw bit into the timber, the explosive could be released and left hanging beneath the target. A clock-like mechanism would wait, strike a spark, and ignite the charge after the submarine had escaped. In theory, the enemy would never know an attack was underway until the ocean erupted beneath the ship. In theory, Bushnell first needed someone willing to enter the machine. His brother Ezra reportedly helped test it in Connecticut, but illness prevented him from carrying out the combat mission. Volunteers were brought in, and Sergeant Ezra Lee was selected. Lee was not a scientist, naval engineer, or professional sailor in the Royal Navy sense. He was a Connecticut soldier serving in the 10th Continental Regiment. He had enlisted at the start of 1776 and now found himself learning a machine no army manual could explain. Lee had little time. The British were already moving around New York. Training required calm water, daylight, repeated practice, and the chance to learn how the machine reacted to every turn of a crank. Combat offered the opposite: darkness, changing tide, enemy patrols, exhaustion, and a target moving slightly at anchor. Washington later believed the machine had not received enough practice under conditions that resembled the real mission. That was not Lee's fault. The strategic clock was moving faster than the training schedule. Still, Lee accepted. That matters because the danger was not abstract. If a valve jammed, he could drown inside the hull. If the craft became trapped beneath a ship, he could be crushed or suffocated. If the timed device started too early, he could be torn apart by his own weapon. If British sailors captured him beside a hidden explosive, he could expect no ordinary treatment as a recognized officer conducting a normal attack. The mission depended on secrecy, and secrecy offered little protection once discovered. The target was Admiral Richard Howe's flagship, HMS Eagle. Eagle carried 64 guns and represented everything the Americans could not match: size, discipline, naval experience, and imperial reach. Destroying her would not eliminate the British fleet, but the psychological effect could be enormous. A flagship exploding at anchor would tell every British captain that darkness and water no longer guaranteed safety. Ships might move farther from shore. Crews might waste nights watching the surface. Even an unsuccessful suspicion could create fear. The plan began with ordinary boats towing Turtle toward the British anchorage to preserve Lee's strength. He would enter the final approach alone, using the darkness to hide the small dome and hatch when he surfaced for air. He needed to reach Eagle near the stern, submerge, place the screw against the underside, attach the charge, release it, then pedal and crank his way back before the timer completed its cycle. Every part depended on the part before it. If the tow ended too far away, Lee would exhaust himself before reaching the target. If he misjudged the current, he would drift past Eagle. If he surfaced at the wrong moment, a lookout would see him. If he could not hold Turtle steady against the hull, the screw would not bite. And if the screw failed, there was no second weapon and no second man to help. Late on September 6 or in the first hours of September 7, depending on how the night is recorded, Lee entered the water. The American boats pulled the strange craft into the harbor and released it. Then they disappeared into the darkness, leaving one man to move toward the British fleet by muscle power. At first, the mission was already going wrong. The current was stronger than Lee had experienced in training. Each turn of the mechanism cost energy. The craft was difficult to steer. Darkness erased distance, and the low shape of Turtle gave him almost no useful view when the hatch was shut. Lee later remembered working toward the ship for hours. Whether every detail of his account can be timed precisely is uncertain. It was written decades after the event, but the central problem is clear. By the time he reached Eagle, the mission had already consumed much of his strength. If you enjoy true military stories where invention meets impossible risk, subscribe now, because Lee is about to reach the flagship, and one failed turn of a screw will trap him between the Royal Navy and a live bomb. Then the moon rose. Dawn was approaching behind it. The darkness protecting Lee was beginning to disappear. He came close enough to see men on the deck and hear their voices. Think about that distance. The Royal Navy's flagship was not a silhouette on the horizon. Lee was beneath its stern, enclosed in wood, close enough to listen to sailors speaking above him. He shut the openings, flooded the ballast, and descended. The Turtle moved beneath Eagle. Lee raised the screw against the ship's bottom and began to turn. It would not enter. For generations, the popular explanation was that Eagle's copper sheathing stopped the drill. That explanation is doubtful. Thin copper would not necessarily have defeated the screw, and historians have proposed other possibilities. Lee may have struck an iron fitting near the rudder, the curved hull may have pushed the unstable craft away, or the current may have prevented him from holding enough pressure against the wood. The surviving evidence cannot prove exactly what blocked him. But inside Turtle, Lee did not have the luxury of historical debate. He had a tool that would not bite, a ship above him, daylight growing and air becoming harder to breathe. He could have abandoned the mission immediately. He did not. Lee pulled along the hull to find another place. It sounds like a small adjustment. Underwater, in darkness, inside a hand-powered vessel, it was not. Moving sideways meant changing his position without losing the ship entirely. He had to control buoyancy, direction, and pressure while fighting the current and his own exhaustion. Then Turtle slipped away from the hull. Without the ship above it, the buoyant craft shot upward. Lee later described the movement as rising 2 or 3 feet above the surface before falling back like a porpoise. For a moment, the secret weapon of the rebellion may have burst into view beside the most important British ship in the harbor. Lee submerged again and tried to recover. But the attack had lost its geometry. Once he drifted away from Eagle, finding the exact position beneath the ship in darkness became almost impossible. The tide was turning. The sky was brightening. His physical strength was nearly gone. The timed charge remained attached to Turtle, but the mechanism that was supposed to place it beneath Eagle had failed. This was the point where the mission changed. Lee was no longer trying to sink the flagship. He was trying to escape a harbor controlled by the Royal Navy while carrying a bomb. He turned away and worked toward the American side. Accounts differ over exactly when British sentries noticed him and from where the pursuit began. Lee later wrote that men came after him in a boat and closed to within roughly 50 or 60 yards. Whether they understood what they were chasing is doubtful. From the surface, Turtle could look like floating debris, a strange buoy, or the head of a swimmer. Lee knew what was attached to his craft. If the pursuers reached him, they might capture the machine and the weapon. They might also kill him before he could explain anything, so he made the most dangerous decision of the night. He released the explosive magazine. Lee later said he hoped that if the British took him, they might also pick up the floating charge, and that all of them would be blown up together. It is a brutal sentence, written without romance. He was exhausted, exposed, and apparently prepared to turn capture into mutual destruction. The pursuing boat pulled back. Lee kept moving. The charge drifted in the harbor as its timer continued to run. Nothing marked it as a weapon. There was no visible fuse leading to shore. It simply floated between the British fleet and the escaping submarine, carrying Bushnell's underwater experiment toward its final test. Then the water exploded. The blast did not strike Eagle. It did not damage a British ship, but witnesses described a violent detonation that threw water high into the air. In a harbor filled with warships, an unexplained explosion beneath the surface carried a message more powerful than the physical damage. Something had attacked from below. Lee survived. The rescue boats reached him and brought him back. He had not destroyed the target, but he had entered the harbor in a machine that many people would have considered impossible, reached the vicinity of a British flagship, attempted to attach an underwater explosive, escaped pursuit, and returned alive. On the most obvious level, the attack failed completely. British casualties were 0. Eagle remained afloat. Admiral Howe continued commanding the fleet. The Americans gained no immediate naval advantage, and there is no known British operational record confirming that the flagship understood how close the attempt had come. Even the exact course of the mission remains debated. Lee wrote his detailed account many years later. No original construction drawings survive. Some naval historians have questioned whether Turtle could have performed exactly as later accounts describe, or whether Lee reached Eagle at all. Those doubts should not be hidden. But they exist beside contemporary evidence that Bushnell built and demonstrated a working submersible, that American leaders supported its use, and that Washington remembered the project long after the war. The mission was also not the end of the experiment. Another attempt was made against a British vessel, but surprise was lost and the attack was abandoned. Later, the craft or the vessel carrying it was reportedly sunk during British action near the Hudson. Bushnell wrote that he recovered the machine, but its ultimate fate is unknown. The original Turtle disappeared. What remains are descriptions, letters, later diagrams, and replicas built by people trying to understand how one man managed its controls. Ezra Lee returned to ordinary war. He continued serving in the Continental Army, received a commission, and fought in major campaigns. Later accounts associate him with battles including Trenton, Brandywine, and Monmouth. At Brandywine, tradition holds that bullets pierced his coat and struck the handle of his sword without killing him. By the time he died in 1821, his underwater mission was only one episode in a long military life. Yet it is the episode that changed how warfare could be imagined. Bushnell and Lee did not invent every concept from nothing. Divers, diving bells, underwater explosives, and earlier submarine proposals existed before them. What made Turtle different was the attempt to combine those ideas into a practical military system, an independently operated underwater craft, controlled buoyancy, human-powered propulsion, navigation in darkness, a detachable explosive, and a timed escape. Those are not decorative similarities to later submarines. They are the essential questions every submarine service would face. How does the vessel dive and surface? How does the crew breathe? How does it move without being seen? How does it navigate when the horizon disappears? How does it deliver a weapon and survive the blast? Turtle's answers were primitive, exhausting, and unreliable, but the questions were correct. 9 years later, George Washington described Bushnell as a man of great mechanical ability and called the submarine project an effort of genius. Washington also explained why it failed: the difficult currents, the complexity of the machine, and the shortage of skilled operators trained well enough to use it. That judgment is important. He did not praise the mission because it sank a ship. It did not. He praised it because the idea had reached the edge of possibility with the materials and knowledge available in 1776. Military innovation often looks foolish immediately before it looks inevitable. A wooden shell powered by one exhausted man could not defeat the Royal Navy. But the belief behind it that a weaker nation could use concealment, engineering, and surprise to threaten a stronger fleet would become one of the defining ideas of naval warfare. The attack also reveals something about the Revolution at its most vulnerable. In September 1776, Washington's army had just escaped disaster on Long Island. Britain controlled the sea. The Americans lacked ships, money, training, and time. Under those conditions, Bushnell did not respond by building a smaller version of a British warship. He tried to make the size of the British warship irrelevant. Eagle's 64 guns pointed outward. Turtle approached from the one direction those guns could not fire. That was the real reversal. The attack failed mechanically, but for a few minutes the most powerful navy in the world faced a kind of threat its broadside cannons could not solve. Today, New York Harbor looks nothing like the dark military anchorage Ezra Lee entered. Ferries cross the water. Towers rise over Manhattan. Governor's Island is a public space, and the exact route of Turtle cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The original vessel is gone, and every surviving model contains educated guesses. But the central image remains clear: one soldier, sealed inside a hand-powered wooden machine, hearing enemy sailors above him and turning a screw that refused to bite. Ezra Lee did not sink Britain's flagship. He did something more important for the future. He proved that a warship could be attacked from a place no lookout had been trained to watch. If you found this story worth watching, subscribe and tell us in the comments which Revolutionary War invention or impossible mission we should cover next.